So glad that you're here today. This is number 15. You can see that on the bottom of the screen, and we got 11 problem. Whether you use the word leaven, it's yeast. When you, I don't fake, I know nothing really about this except I know the concept that yeast is it bacteria? And I had no idea. But when you put it into the bread rises. It changes the nature of the thing. And the yeast that we're going to talk about today is something that disciples of all ages need to understand, particularly leaders have to understand. So we're going to get to this. We're going to get to some practical conclusions by the time we're done. One of the things that knocks people who start in ministry out of the saddle is that it doesn't go as well as they think it was. It's like they thought, because they theoretically in the classroom or with others felt like they were having great momentum with the wind at their back. And then they get into a local church ministry or a missions ministry, and they feel like they're running in mud. They don't feel like they're getting anywhere. I think what Jesus wanted to teach his disciples is very important. Now, in Avery Bruce's book, which I love and very much enjoying, we're this far where the clip is through it. So we got a long way to go to get through. In his book, he gives the outline, but I don't think he's as strong on the application as he could be. And I'm trying to amplify that. Once you get a copy of the book, you can actually buy a new one. It's not inexpensive, and it's out of copyright. So if you really, really want a copy, I'll give you a digital version of the existing copy. But I'm redoing it over this year of 2025 so that it modernizes the verbiage and frankly gets rid of some of the obscure words that I have to look up in the dictionary because they had better vocabularies then than I have today. And my guess is better than yours. And so might get tripped up on a word going forward. The concept of breakthrough pathways is a concept that we developed. It's a trademarked term that we developed that talks about the things that need to happen, not the theologies, but the ways of going about things in local churches that are well, might use the term disciplines, but activities or methodologies that you use individually, not in the public meetings, but behind the scenes to teach people the disciplines, the attitudes, the approaches, the methods to do things that really help them. For example, one of the breakthrough pathways is actually just taking in information by reading. You have to read to lead. And so what we're trying to do is get you to read. Now, reading is sometimes physically off of a page, and that's an interesting activity because in reading, you take these little squiggly marks on a page that you were taught when you were very young that are put together, a series of them, maybe 3, 5, 10 of these little squiggly things are put together, and we have an interpreter in our brain. It's amazing. We take these squiggly lines and we say, oh, that means so-and-so. And if you take a look at some other scripts, like the Burmese script, we have a big influence in doing orphanages in Myanmar. Really excited about that. That's a whole other thing that's off the topic of breakthrough pathways, but they've got this very cursive kind of squiggly stuff. I have no idea what the letters are. I can't read it. Didn't grow up with that, and highly likely you didn't either. But you might see Arabic letters or Hebrew letters or Chinese and Japanese symbols, and those symbols are amazing how we can take them from a printed form and interpret it in our brain to turn them into words that we can vocalize. And it's an amazing process. We've moved away a lot from reading to doing things that are audio and video. When you think about it, it's really quite amazing that just a little over 100 years now that we've been able to have one person speaking and it going out mysteriously into the ether and the air and be broadcasted in such a way that millions of people could listen to it on the other end. Millions don't necessarily listen or watch, but it could. And something's become extremely popular, and the amount of noise is incredible that's out there. If you think about what the foundation of where we're putting this out right now on YouTube for free. I have a whole broadcasting capacity off of a phone. I'm actually using a webcam and a bit of a drop here and so on. But you could just do it on your phone live off of, free to the world, and others could see it, whether it be on Facebook or YouTube or some other platform. It's quite amazing. You can have a 1 to a bazillion people. It didn't have it that simple back in the day. And we've confused ourselves by not taking this pathway of assimilating information, reading, so that you become the one who is leading. And we need to develop the capacity to take in this information, whether it be off of the page, which has a lot of advantages to it. You can go at your own pace, and you can check things out and stop and ponder them. Where when you're watching a video, it might have more emotive capacity to the thing, but your mind tends to wander. You have, wait a minute, I'm not sure that what he said makes sense to me. I've listened to some Christian speakers and they go rat-a-tat, tat-tat, and it sounds really good and it sounds like it's intellectual, but if you break down the words, I have no idea what they're saying. And so there's an element of confusion. What we want to do is we want to work in local churches to get people to use tools like that, like reading, and teach them to young people so that they grow up assimilating more information. If they assimilate more of the right information, some of them will be raised up by God to lead in the next generation. We have a paucity, a lack of leaders growing up right now. And we've got a lot of people who say, well, I'll follow. I'll get on the bus if somebody else will drive the bus. We have a problem with that. So what my friend Richard Fleming and I did is we wrote this book. I did most of the writing, but he went over it with a fine-tooth comb and helped with the thinking process. We developed this all, and it's available to you now. You can get it on Amazon, and I hope you will. I sincerely, it's not yet in an ebook form. It will be in that 2 weeks, but it's in a print form. And I would prefer that you have the print form in front of it and get a pen or a marker and Sharpie or something, a highlighter, and mark it up, if you will. Wreck the book. Think about it. Think about these things and think, how will you integrate those concepts, those pathways into the life of your church? Now, that's where we start. But in using those pathways, we need to get to where Jesus got to and where Bruce is talking about things in the life of the church and how we can teach people to be more of what Jesus wants them to be. So today we're going to look at this yeast problem we just introduced to you. This yeast problem where things come in that change radically the way things ought to be. I've found in explaining the concepts of how we implement the breakthrough pathways, there's a methodology here using rotating triads. You got to get the book to understand it. How we work with people without a designated leader, and you got to read the book to understand that, so that we can put 3 people together to actually have a collaborative discussion and create feedback where it can get into their soul, into their minds, where they can understand things. People have a hard time assimilating new concepts. My favorite illustration is trying to explain a digital watch to a Swiss watchmaker who could and still can, and they still do, make magnificent little intricate things, and they say, this is better. There's no reason why it's better. It works very well when the Swiss watchmaker gets it done well. You know, the spring in it, you have to wind it up and so on. But digital clocks work better. Everybody's got one in their pocket now, on their phone and computers and so on. It works much better. But you try to explain that to a Swiss watchmaker back in the 1600s, he'll say, well, that'll never fly. That'll never work. We've entered a phase right now in the religion of North America where people will say, oh, well, no, we're doing fine with our Swiss watch. It's we're just going to wind it more often. We're going to press it into use more often. We're going to just work harder to get people to read the watches, where I think that we need to change the way we're approaching people so that it is more of a personal, relational thing going forward. That's kind of wrong one on the left. Where we're moving is through the system, as Bruce does, to look at the life of Jesus and see how he struggled with these neophytes to make them into the leaders that they were to become. So we're going to look at that chapter, and I will quite openly declare to you that while we look at that process, I'm throwing in a lot of my own ideas mixed with my study of Bruce's ideas. Today, we're looking at the leaven, the yeast of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. Now, we've got to give a very brief concept here. Pharisees and Sadducees are both Hebrews. They were column churches. They were religious groups in their day. They did not get along with one another. And it's quite interesting that the Pharisees and the Sadducees united together against the common enemy, Jesus. There's an old proverb that says, does it say, the enemy of my enemy is my friend? Yeah, I think that's what it says. The idea that two people who wouldn't otherwise get along together and cooperate to attack somebody in the future. Now, the problem that we need to address today is that we have leaven in the church, this attitude that takes whatever they can to rise up against something else. A lot of religious leaders got ahead in the past and get ahead today by having a common enemy. The common enemy today is often something to do with the way the government is operating. Now, I think we've given the government way too much credit for controlling the society. The church should be there as positive leaven in the society from the bottom, bubbling up because of our attitudes and electing the right kind of people so that the government becomes a government with a higher level of integrity than what perhaps you might see now. But we get political parties sometimes uniting together against the common enemy, the other party, and they misconstrue what the person says. They tell lies about them. They do opposition research to find out what's wrong with the other guy. And they say, yeah, well, back in 1948, this guy sneezed once and he sneezed in his mother's face and she COVID and she died. We didn't even know it was COVID back then. And it's crazy things that they develop. And this need for some people to have an enemy because they know that they can get people to unite against a common enemy. The Pharisees and the Sadducees were doing that with Jesus, and Jesus is saying, watch out for this. This is really bad. Now, he is recorded in the Gospels in Matthew and Mark, not in Luke and John. We have this story about the Pharisees coming to Jesus. So we're going to look at that. Now, there's a crowd that gathered again, and they were hungry again, and they got fed again. And it was necessary to give them another miracle feeding. This was the concept. And the leaders, these Pharisees and Sadducees, they don't even belong in the same sentence. But they came to Jesus afterwards and said, you're going to give us a sign that you're from heaven. It's like, what? Have we fed these massive crowds of people? Yes, but that was not a sign from heaven. This was some chicanery, some trickery that you maybe did here on earth. But we're looking for manna that comes from heaven, just like what our old religion taught us it should be like. This was the attitude that they brought towards the thing, just truly amazing. And they think that somehow through the power of the devil, through some other trickery, that he'd fed these thousands of people and had food left over that proved that there was, in fact, real food. It was just crazy. But they wanted something more. They wanted this heavenly proof. And they rejected the miracles that they had already seen. So they came and said, what are you going to do? And Jesus says, no, not going to do it. Not going to do it. And the only sign I'll give you, according to Matthew, is that of Jonah. They don't even, he's just very shadowy on that. That doesn't say that he explained it, but, it's the story that's mentioned in other places in Scripture that a parallel is Jonah was in the belly of a whale, the great fish, for 3 days. So the Son of Man they just didn't get that, and the disciples didn't get it. Certainly the Pharisees and the Sadducees didn't get it, but it didn't matter. that Jesus wasn't going to give them another feeding of 4,001. It wasn't going to give them another healing. They'd seen these healings. They'd had plenty of evidence if they were open to pay attention to it. But one of the problems with the leaven, the yeast of the Pharisees, is it gets so focused in on a tunnel vision that it doesn't see the whole picture. And that becomes a huge problem in religious movements, and it's a problem today in our world. So Jesus says, beware. Beware of these people who drag you in that direction. There's something attractive about that, wanting to fight the other guy. I don't know what it stirs up in the endorphins in our brains somehow that brings this aggressiveness out of people. But both the Pharisees and the Sadducees were off base, as many people today have the tendency to be off base. And frankly, an awful lot of other cults and religions have grown based on this idea that the other guy didn't get it right. Beware of anybody that says the other guy is really bad. I may be different, and it's okay to be different. But to attack the other guy is bad so that you'll look good is a really negative idea. So the Pharisees and the Sadducees, both from the end of the day, were participants in the demise of Jesus from their perspective. Of course, it wasn't the demise. It was part of the eternal plan that we celebrate, the beauty of the cross. They were united together against Jesus. Now, to have this kind of yeast, this spiritual poison, if we call it that, yeast is not poison. We think of it as a poison that spreads, as a virus that spreads through us. It's built on false desires and expectations. In this case, they wanted another sign from heaven, one more miracle. One more miracle is never going to convince anybody. They were blind. The Pharisees and the Sadducees were blind, and the disciples were just emerging out of their blindness. They needed changed hearts, all of them, not external evidence. We don't need a new podcast today. We don't need a new way of doing church buildings. We don't need a new way of meeting to solve things. We need changed hearts that get down to the foundations of what it is that needs to be developed. We think that these pathways will help you do that. And there may be other pathways that we've missed. Again, I want you to read the book. You can go and read some things about it, and over time, as we develop, there will be a lot of good things that are available.
The church is at a crossroads. Attendance is down, communities are disconnected, and many wonder what's next. At Breakthrough Pathways, we believe the answer isn't in more program professionals, it's in you, ordinary people making a real difference.
Join us live every Thursday at 10 a.m. for real conversations, real solutions, and a renewed vision for the future of the church. Let's build something that lasts. Subscribe today and be part of the breakthrough.
Well, you can be a part of the breakthrough, but that doesn't mean that all the other guys are doing bad. Some people are doing good things, some doing a little better than others. Most churches are on a plateau or in decline, and Jesus sent us to find more sheep, as he said in John chapter 10. There's other sheep that belong, and if we are not growing, then there's something fundamentally wrong. But it started with the disciples because they were fundamentally not understanding what Jesus was saying. They did get to it eventually, and that's one of the beautiful things of the gospel. But the disciples were missing the point. They thought that Jesus was talking about more physical bread, and he was talking about spiritual truths. And in this story that's recorded for us in Matthew and Mark, they had this worry that they were so engaged in the process that they'd forgotten to get physical food, and they were really upset about it. And Jesus used that as a springboard to say the big problem is not your physical problems in time and in space. Your problems are in here. The problems are the matters of the heart. And they didn't grasp the spiritual lessons. They were thinking shallowly. And Jesus saw that this was headed in a really bad direction. And their understanding was so limited. And at one point in the midst of the story in Mark, it says, Jesus sighed in his spirit, he sighed inwardly. Even though he understood it was happening and it would happen, it burdened Jesus, just like negativity ought to burden us today. So you can find that religion, whatever the religion is, that the group thing that's out there is going to oppose you if you are on the right track. In fact, you can know if you're on the right track if there is opposition. There's not a guarantee there, but it is guaranteed that if you're on the right track, you're going to get resistance from the religious groups. And it might be present day denomination or some other denomination. And the enemy of my enemy is my friend. So if you start to make any progress, you will have people who will create TikTok videos that pull out a little piece of what you've said here and a little piece from there, and they'll put it together and say, see, this guy's the bad guy. I am so sick looking at some of these things that talk about the other guy being the bad guy and they actually being false teachers and so on. Some people who I've highly respected in the past have gotten infected with this leaven, this yeast of negativity. There was the attitudinal problem that was breaking things down. We've got to understand that attitude is king, and having the right attitude is exactly the right approach to things. The right attitude comes from a base of love, not from a base of opposition, from a base of focusing on the truth, not focusing on where the other guy is wrong. And it's not to say that you can't point out that where the other guy is wrong. Jesus did that frequently, but the emphasis in our world today has got to be on what can help that person that's there today in our world or just on the edge of our world, where we can help them. People, generally speaking, in North American society think that every church is in opposition to every other church, and that's a bad attitude. We don't want to portray that attitude. I have nothing against the other guy to say in a public way. I have evaluations, and I'm willing to discuss evaluations. I'm willing to sit down with the person who's very different than me and listen to their story and so on. But where they're wrong, they're wrong. And if I'm right about them being wrong, then I might, in the judicious circumstances, tell others about it, but I won't make that the essence. The message of the gospel is always going to be understood by a few and misunderstood by many. So what difference does that make to the emerging disciple, to somebody who's helping to come alongside in a church? And at the moment, I'm thinking of kind of the elders or deacons board that you have in the church, maybe a half a dozen people who are there trying to work on a collaborative basis united with you, perhaps as a lead pastor or maybe other staff members as well. You can expect that there's going to be resistance to your collective movement. Some of that resistance may be well-founded. Most of it is probably not well-founded. It's certainly not well-founded if the attitude is to just take you down. And when you get involved in leadership in church, you're going to find that it gets tedious. You too are going to, like Jesus, sigh sometimes about what people complain about. I had one man in a church once who came to me and he complained about a son-in-law of his, because his son-in-law wore black shirts, and that was evil. And he'd say the word evil. And it's like, oh, wow. The guy liked black shirts. Get over it. And this man never actually got over the fact that his son's evilness was not something that he should be complaining about. There may have been things of a son-in-law that were other attitudinal things that were a matter. That wasn't one of them. And that man ultimately ended up running off and doing major evil things himself, things directly spoken of in the scripture. And he's gone, I presume, to be with the Lord now. But I thought at the time, oh, how tedious it is to deal with people who think that somebody wearing a black shirt is bad. I mean, come on, I was a Johnny Cash fan back in the day. Get over it, people. Major on majors, don't major on minors. Don't get caught up with this leaven of the world in which you have saturated yourself, with the silo in which you live. social media. So broaden your perspective. We need leaders in our church who do that, who will handle the confusion like Jesus handled the confusion. Come on. In this one story, we've got Pharisees and Sadducees and the disciples, and they're all confused. And Jesus handled it, didn't give up on them. He stayed with them. He got frustrated with them quite clearly. In the story, he says, oh man, how long do I have to put up with this nonsense? He got frustrated just like we get frustrated. But he never quit, and he kept on going. Now, you can believe that if you are the right example, you can expect an evolution in others, not thousands. They could be for some that won't have thousands, but that's rare. 1 or 2 or 5 or 10 over a lifetime who will actually become more of what God has called them to be. It is so important that we develop the right attitude without this poisonous negativity that can grow up and overwhelm all of the other good things that we've got. You know, it's easy to think that the other guy's got a problem. The denominational leader should be doing this. The associate pastor won't work. The deacons' boards won't agree to anything that I want to do. The members of the church aren't paying attention. I need to get them to turn up the volume somehow. And you it's easy to fall into a trap of just yelling at the people. I listened to one man's sermons, a couple of them I was going to listen to some years ago, and I went back to the person after listening to a little sermon, and I said, I feel like I need another bath. And that he was just so hard to deal with, rather than being the inspirational person that God had called him to be. Jesus was pointing out the scribes and Pharisees, how they were messing up. And it's so easy for you to fall into the trap of messing up by focusing on the wrong things, by majoring on minor things. And during the COVID epidemic, can't even say, you know what it was. I saw so many people. I saw some that fell away, and they were quite sure that whatever, there was a Chinese conspiracy, the government wasn't handling it right, and then this vaccine was going to kill people and not help people. And they started to blend that leaven into what was supposed to be the gospel ministry, and many wrecked their ministry by being overcome by these secondary issues. They needed to be like Jesus and just get in the boat and go to the other side of the sea. That was his solution. Get out of there. Don't get engaged in it. Don't get sucked in. Don't even get sucked in too far into trying to explain it. Beware. There's this big silent train that is always creeping up on you from behind. And if you get caught up on it, it's going to ruin your ministry. And if you are trying to lead other people into ministry, so many people quit ministry. Why? Because there's something negative came into their lives, something that broke their expectations. Perhaps they got overburdened by trying harder and harder and harder at the wrong things and not finding the things that would give them a breakthrough in their own life going forward. That's exactly what we all need, is breakthrough pathways. And I just want you today to think about that. Where might you have the bad attitude towards things? Where might you not be supporting the thing that you should be supporting because it's not perfect? There'll never be a perfect person other than Jesus. There'll never be a perfect program. But there are some that you can support and be engaged in with your time, with your abilities, with your money. Money is often a stranglehold of ministries. Our whole breakthrough pathway system, we want to get out into local churches, and we don't have the money to do it. Richard and I had to do it kind of as volunteers with part of our time. We could use your donations to help us spread the good news, how to take ordinary people and raise them up so that some of them will raise up to become leaders in the local church. That's what we need, and you can be a part of it. And come back again, and we'll get to the next lesson next week.